Welcome back to Beyond the Badge, the place where we find the stories the world almost forgot to tell, where ordinary lives carry the weight of extraordinary courage, where a child with nothing but a library card, a worn-out notebook, and a mother who refused to stop believing can walk into a room full of the most powerful minds in the country and remind every single one of them why they fell in love with learning in the first place. Today, we have a story for you. It is not about a battlefield. It is not about a courtroom. It is not about the famous or the celebrated. It is about a 9-year-old boy named Caleb Owens, a folding chair, a composition notebook with a cracked spine, and a room full of 600 experts in Chicago, Illinois, who had already decided, before he opened his mouth, that he did not belong there. They were wrong. And the way they found out? That is the story we are here to tell. The Illinois Academic Mathematics Symposium was held every November inside the Hartwell Convention Center on Michigan Avenue, a building of polished marble floors, brass chandeliers, and the particular kind of quiet that comes from decades of prestige and old money. 600 seats, nearly every one of them filled. Professors, researchers, department chairs from universities across the Midwest, grant administrators who decided with the stroke of a pen which young minds were worth nurturing and which were not. People who had spent entire careers inside the comfortable certainty that brilliance had a particular shape, a particular background, a particular zip code. And near the back of the room, in a folding chair that had been added after the official seating count was already done, sat a boy who had come from a zip code none of them had ever thought to look in. His name was Caleb Owens. He was 9 years old. He wore a pale blue button-down shirt, slightly large at the shoulders, that his mother had found at the Goodwill on Pulaski Road 2 days earlier, pressing it carefully with a travel iron borrowed from her neighbor until every single crease was gone, until it looked, she had whispered to herself in the quiet of their kitchen at midnight, good enough for any room in the world. His sneakers did not quite reach the floor. On Caleb's lap sat a black and white composition notebook, soft from months of daily handling, its cover worn at the corners, its pages filled from margin to margin with numbers, geometric diagrams, and the small, deliberate handwriting of a child who had taught himself to think in a language most adults spent entire lifetimes pursuing. He did not look like a mathematician. He looked like someone's little brother who had wandered into the wrong building on the wrong day. That was the first mistake this room would make today. It would not be the last. Caleb Owens had grown up in Englewood, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where corner stores outnumbered the bookstores, where schools were underfunded and classrooms overcrowded, and where the word gifted was rarely spoken, because the systems designed to find gifted children had long ago stopped looking there with any real intention. He lived in a third-floor walk-up apartment with his mother, Loretta Owens, a woman of quiet strength and enormous dignity, who worked the early shift at a hospital linen facility 5 days a week and spent her Friday evenings cleaning office buildings downtown to make the rent in months when overtime did not come through. Loretta was 43 years old. She had raised Caleb alone since he was 2. She had never remarried. She had never stopped working. And she had never, not once in 9 years, stopped telling her son that his mind was the most valuable thing in the world, that no building, no room, no institution, and no person on this earth had the right to tell him otherwise. She had recognized something in Caleb early, not just intelligence. Children can be intelligent in many ways. What Loretta had seen in her son was clarity. The way, at age 4, he had noticed that the pattern on their kitchen linoleum tiles followed a repeating geometric sequence. The way at 6, he had quietly corrected the subtraction error on a grocery store receipt. The way numbers did not feel like a subject to him. They felt like a language he had always already known. The way some children simply know music before they are ever taught a single scale. She could not afford gifted programs. She could not afford summer enrichment camps or private tutors or any of the supplemental advantages available to families in neighborhoods north of where they lived. What she could give him was a Chicago Public Library card.
And so Caleb had grown up inside the Harold Washington Library on State Street, 4th floor, mathematics section, same wooden chair beside the window every Saturday morning, reading books whose titles he could barely lift, watching university lectures on a tablet with a hairline crack across its corner, pausing and rewinding until the logic settled in him the way breathing did, like it had always been there, just waiting for words.
He filled notebook after notebook with problems found in the back pages of advanced textbooks, in the footnotes of academic journals, in sections marked "See Open Questions" and "As Yet Unresolved." And in one of those footnotes, sometime between his 8th and 9th birthdays, he found a problem that stopped him completely. It was called the Callaway conjecture. First posed in 1979 by the mathematician Dr. George Callaway, it proposed that under specific periodic constraints, infinite planar graphs obeyed the same coloring rules as finite ones, a deceptively simple idea, catastrophically difficult to prove. Careers had been built around it, papers had been written, celebrated, and quietly withdrawn. It sat in the mathematics community the way certain mountains sit in certain landscapes, enormous, permanent, and utterly unconquered. Caleb read the original paper 3 times, and then he noticed something that 40 years of brilliant adults had walked right past. The woman who recognized what he had found was named Dr. Vivian Mercer. She ran the Southside Community Learning Initiative out of a converted storefront on 63rd Street, a scrappy, underfunded, and fiercely dedicated organization offering free mathematics enrichment to students from neighborhoods the city's elite programs had never meaningfully served. She was 52, precise, warm in the way that people are warm when they have chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to give their best gifts to the people who need them most. She had met Caleb 18 months earlier, when Loretta had walked him through her door on a Tuesday afternoon and said simply and without apology, "My son needs someone who can keep up with him." Dr. Mercer had smiled. She had handed Caleb a problem from a graduate-level combinatorics textbook, the kind she used to quickly assess the difference between a bright child and something rarer. Caleb solved it in 4 minutes. Then he looked up and asked if there were harder ones. Dr. Mercer had known from that moment exactly what she was looking at. 18 months later, she made a phone call that Loretta Owens would remember for the rest of her life. "Your son has written something," Dr. Mercer said quietly. "Something I believe is real, and I think the world needs to see it." The man who would try to stop that from happening was named Dr. Harold Stanton, 60 years old, tenured professor at the University of Chicago, founder of the Illinois Academic Mathematics Symposium, a man who had spent 31 years of his life chasing the very same Callaway conjecture, publishing, revising, and republishing his own incomplete attempts more times than he liked to count or remember. He was not malicious, he was something more common and more corrosive. He was a man whose identity had become so entangled with his status that the idea of being surpassed by a 9-year-old from Englewood with a library card had activated something in him he would later spend years being ashamed of. But that morning in the Hartwell Convention Center, the shame had not arrived yet. The symposium program listed him 4th on the afternoon schedule. Name, Caleb Owens. School, Thurgood Marshall Elementary, Englewood. Title, A Constructive Resolution of the Callaway Conjecture via Periodicity Constraints and Tiling Reframing. There had been murmuring when the programs were distributed that morning. Not loud murmuring, the quiet, sideways kind. The kind that travels in exchanged glances and the slight, involuntary raising of eyebrows. Someone near the front had laughed once, softly, through his nose. A doctoral student 3 rows back had leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something that included the words, "elementary school." Dr. Stanton had read the listing twice at breakfast. Then he had summoned the symposium coordinator and asked, with careful composure, how the submission had cleared the review process. The coordinator explained. Dr. Vivian Mercer had submitted it through standard channels. The abstract had passed through 3 reviewers. 2 had flagged it as exceptional. 1 had written the word unprecedented in the margin of his review sheet. Stanton said nothing further, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something that had less to do with mathematics and more to do with 31 years of his life spent chasing a problem that a 9-year-old from a neighborhood he had never visited appeared to have solved in a composition notebook from the dollar store. When Caleb walked to the front of the auditorium that afternoon, notebook tucked under one arm, his mother's carefully pressed shirt slightly large at the shoulders, Dr. Stanton did not rise to introduce him the way he had introduced every other presenter that day. He remained at the panelist table, arms folded, expression neutral, the way certain kinds of dismissal present themselves as neutrality. The microphone stand was too tall for Caleb. He adjusted it slowly, both small hands reaching upward.
Someone in the center of the room left, a single, unguarded sound that died almost immediately when no one else joined it. Then the notebook slipped from under Caleb's arm. It fell, pages scattered across the front of the stage, 49 pages of 7 months of work, fanning out across the floor in front of 600 people. Caleb knelt. He gathered them one by one, carefully, without rushing. His jaw was set, his eyes were down. In the fifth row, Loretta Owen sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine absolutely straight, and her eyes completely still. She had prepared herself for this. She had prayed about it at 5 o'clock that morning, in the dark of her kitchen, while the city was still quiet and her son was still sleeping in the next room. She had not prepared enough.
When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of someone who has spent years in conversation with ideas so large and so certain that raising your voice around them would feel almost disrespectful. He did not begin with his proof. He began with a question. Has anyone here ever looked at a problem for so long that you stopped noticing what was wrong with the question itself? The room went still in a different way than it had been still before. The Callaway conjecture, he continued, looking up from his notebook, is not an unsolvable problem. It is an incomplete one. Dr. Callaway asked whether infinite planar graphs obey the four-color rule, but he never specified what kind of infinite graph. Without a periodicity constraint, the question has no stable answer. It is like asking how far a road goes without telling me where it starts. In the fifth row, Dr. Vivian Mercer exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time all morning. Because Caleb was not nervous anymore. The moment the mathematics started, he never was. This was the thing Dr. Mercer had noticed from the very beginning, that numbers were not a performance for Caleb Owens. They were a homecoming. The moment he stepped into the interior logic of a problem, something else arrived in him, something older, steadier. He began drawing on the board, clean, confident lines, nodes connected by edges, expanding outward in careful periodic intervals. He narrated as he drew, not reading from his notebook, but speaking from memory, the way a person speaks about a place they know so completely they no longer need a map. Then Dr. Stanton stood. He told himself he was being rigorous, scientific. He told himself in the fraction of a second it took to rise from his chair, quite a number of things that were not entirely true. Before we proceed, he said, voice carrying easily across the auditorium, I would like to pose a preliminary question, a foundational exercise, simply to establish familiarity with the relevant literature. The room understood what was happening. Stanton projected a sequence problem, standard graduate-level material, the kind designed in this moment to expose a gap, to reveal what was not there. Caleb looked at the slide for 5 seconds. There is an error, he said. Something flickered behind Stanton's expression. The third iteration uses a transition rule that contradicts the boundary condition in step 1. If we accept the slide as written, the sequence terminates at step 6. The corrected version, which matches the methodology from your own 2009 paper in the Journal of Discrete Mathematics, would proceed like this. He turned to the board. He wrote the correction in under 30 seconds. In the second row, Dr. Constance Albright of Purdue University pressed her lips together carefully. Her expression said something she was not yet ready to say aloud. Stanton regrouped. He projected a 58-node graph, notorious in the field for its complexity, and challenged Caleb to find any coloring error on screen. Caleb studied it for 8 seconds. Nodes 39 and 44 share an edge. They have been assigned the same color. The error carries through the lower quadrant from there. He was exactly correct, and everyone who knew that graph, which was most of the room, knew it immediately. The atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, quietly, the way barometric pressure shifts before a storm. Dr. Stanton had one card remaining. He had received a written objection that morning from a colleague at MIT, a respected name in the field, who had flagged a potential inconsistency in the abstract Dr. Mercer had circulated in advance. Stanton read it aloud to the full room, every word, slowly. For the first time all afternoon, Caleb paused. He looked down at his notebook, turned 3 pages, read something, looked back up. The observation is correct that the line appears inconsistent in isolation, but the domain restriction I establish in Section 3 limits the application to graphs satisfying the periodicity constraint defined in Section 2. Within that domain, the line holds. Outside that domain, I never claimed it did. I believe the objection was based on the abstract rather than the full proof. He said it without agitation, without performance, the way you say something that is simply, quietly, entirely true. And then, in a silence that had grown very heavy, Caleb's voice broke. Not completely, just a small, involuntary fracture.
The kind that escapes a 9-year-old boy who has been standing before 600 adults for 45 minutes, fielding challenges designed not to test his mathematics, but to exhaust his dignity. He turned back to the board. He pressed the marker against the surface. His small shoulders rose and fell once. Loretta Owens gripped her own hands in her lap. Dr. Constance Albright stood up. "I would like to suggest," she said, each word placed with surgical precision, "that we allow this presenter to complete his demonstration without further interruption. The questions being raised are legitimate mathematical questions. They are not, however, being raised in good faith, and every person in this room knows the difference." The silence that followed was unlike anything the Hartwell Convention Center had held before. Dr. Stanton sat down. Caleb turned back to the room. His eyes were bright. He took one slow, full breath and picked up the marker. What followed was the demonstration, a live, real-time coloring of a complex periodic graph, a structure every mathematician in that room recognized as one of the most notoriously difficult benchmarks in their entire field. Caleb worked through it methodically, node by node, color by color, his voice growing steadier with every single line he drew. When he finally capped the marker and stepped back from the board, the graph was complete. Every node colored, no two adjacent nodes sharing a shade. Across an infinite periodic structure, the 4-color rule held. And the proof was not simply correct. It was beautiful. Dr. Constance Albright rose first, then a professor from the University of Illinois, then 3 people from the back of the room, then, in ones and twos, and then a quiet, unstoppable wave, the entire auditorium. 600 people, standing. For a 9-year-old boy from Englewood, in his mother's thrift store shirt, holding a worn composition notebook in both hands. Caleb looked out at the room. He did not smile right away. He looked first, at the 5th row, at a woman with a straight spine and folded hands, and eyes that had been holding everything still for 45 minutes. Loretta Owens was not holding anything still anymore. She stood, and she let the tears come, quietly, the way she did everything. Not for the crowd, not for the moment. For every 5 o'clock morning, for every bus ride to the library, for every night at the kitchen table, listening to things she did not fully understand, because the listening had been the only gift she had left to give. It had been enough. It had always been enough. The reception afterward was held in the lobby. Caleb stood near the far end of a refreshment table, composition notebook tucked under his arm, surrounded by mathematicians who had driven from across the Midwest, asking him real questions now, the kind that travel between equals. He answered them patiently, thoroughly, without hurry. It was Dr. Stanton who found him last. The older man crossed the marble lobby slowly, his own program folded and refolded in one hand. He stopped a few feet from Caleb and stood quietly, the kind of quiet that belongs to a man who is choosing, very carefully, between 2 versions of himself. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was lower than the room had ever heard it. Caleb looked up at him, 9 years old, white button-down shirt, slightly large at the shoulders, composition notebook under one arm. He extended his hand. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for making me defend it. The harder it got, the more certain I became that it was right." Stanton took his hand, held it a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. "I wrote you a letter," Stanton said, "before today. A recommendation for the Junior Research Fellowship at the University of Chicago. I want you to have it." Caleb blinked. "You wrote it before today?" "Yes, because I read the full proof, and I knew." "Then why?" Stanton shook his head, not to deflect, to answer honestly. "Fear," he said. "I spent 31 years on that conjecture. I told myself I was protecting the integrity of the process. I was not. I was afraid." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, in the same steady voice he had used at the board, "If mathematics is really about truth, then it does not matter who finds it. It only matters that it is found." Harold Stanton nodded once, and something in his face changed, not into happiness, but into something quieter. The relief of a man given, at 60 years old, the chance to be a little better than he was. Within a month, the Southside Community Learning Initiative had received over $50,000 in new donations. Within 3 months, student applications from underserved Chicago neighborhoods had increased by more than 300%. The Callaway conjecture was formally verified and published the following spring. In the acknowledgments, Caleb listed 6 names. The first was his mother. The last was Harold Stanton. When a journalist asked why, Caleb thought for a long moment. Because he made me prove it was real. And in the end, he told the truth. Being afraid doesn't make you a bad person. What makes you who you are is what you do when the fear passes. And how do you feel about what you accomplished? Caleb smiled. Small and private. The smile of someone who has already moved on to the next problem. I feel like I finally answered the question underneath the question, he said. The math was the easy part.
Here on Beyond the Badge, we believe that courage does not always arrive wearing a uniform. Sometimes it arrives in a thrift store button-down shirt, slightly too large at the shoulders. Sometimes it arrives with 9 years of Saturday mornings in a library chair by the window. And sometimes, the most powerful kind of courage, it arrives in the form of a woman working 2 jobs, riding a bus across a city that has not always been kind to her, sitting in a room that never reserved her a seat, and believing, with her whole quiet and unshakable heart, in something the world has not yet learned to see. Caleb Owens did not just solve a conjecture that outlasted 40 years of brilliant minds. He asked, gently, unmistakably, and with the full authority of truth, the question every great institution must eventually face. How much genius have we already walked past, simply because it did not arrive in the form we expected? That is what lives beyond the badge. That is Loretta. That is Caleb. That is every child the world has not yet learned to believe in. We see them here. We always will. If this story moved you today, if you believe that brilliance lives in places the world too often overlooks, then do one simple thing. Subscribe to Beyond the Badge. Hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere right now, there is a child sitting in a library or at a kitchen table with a notebook full of answers the world has not yet thought to ask for. And the only thing standing between that child and the room they deserve is one person willing to believe first. Be that person. We will see you in the next story.